Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to the American Academy. I'm Gerd Kasper. I'm the president of the American Academy. And I introduced a tradition that is exactly like 8 months old, that when we have one of our fellows, we have a German person to introduce the fellow. And my role here, therefore, is not to introduce the introducer. That would take a long time, in particular in the case of Professor Tripp. But just to say a few words about the introducer, as I will. I'm also very happy to welcome the Deputy Cultural Attaché of the US Embassy, and I'm very glad, Mr. Fowler, there you are. I'm very glad that you also have an interest in Adam Kraft, as everybody else in this room does. So we are off to a very good start in that respect. Professor Tripp is an art historian with Catholic interests. Now, that has a double meaning. In my text, my notes, I spelled Catholic with a small c, just to suggest his interests were wide and broad. And when I admired him earlier during the reception, said to him, I admire the Catholicity of your interests, he kind of thought I had spelled it with a capital C and pointed out that he was a Protestant. And not just any old Protestant, but that he came from a fundamentalist background in Württemberg. And so we welcome all kinds of people here, Professor Tripp, and it is just fine. His present position is that of Professor for the History of Art in Material Culture at the University of Engineering, Economics and Culture in Leipzig. Before that, he was a professor for the Comparative History of European Art at the University of Florence. Now, as distinguished from most academics, Professor Tripp has a knack for great titles. I read his entire bibliography, and I could actually entertain you all evening by just reading his bibliography, which is fantastic. Thus, in 2005, he published a book on Niklaus Manuel's Dance of Death in Bern, which he called Den Würmern wirst du Wildbret sein. For the worms you will be venison. Now just contemplate that thought and don't forget it until you get to that point. Another monograph on the role of animals in Italian Trecento paintings was simply entitled Giotto Paints a Laughing Camel. Now that is my ideal of a descriptive title. And I also like the title of an article about a Bern monastery, Bern as in the capital of Switzerland, a Bern monastery where the canons led a merry life with mistresses and children. And the Reformation constituted liberation in a more than a theological sense. And of course, they promptly got married once the Reformation, once Bern had adopted the Reformation. The article, of which I read as much as is permitted by Google, you must have had the same experience when you go to Google Books. You begin to read a book, pages, indeed several pages, and then just when it gets interesting, it says, this page is not published in this text, is not available. Available, I think is the word, not available in this text. So, in this reproduction. The article, of which I read quite a lot, is entitled Feeling for Art and the Itch to Marry. Clearly in Bern, celibacy was apparently not a paramount value. Professor Tripp in 1998 published a book on the significance of church buildings and their furnishings during the Gothic period. Its title, I think, having read his entire bibliography, its title is expressive of Professor Tripp's interests. Das handelnde Bildwerk. Now that is also a wonderful title. Das handelnde Bildwerk, the acting piece of art. But before we will get to Corine's acting pieces of art, Professor Tripp will act here.
What shall I say, huh? Well, it's not my evening. I thank you so much. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Corine Schleif studied art history at Washington University in St. Louis, where she received her MA in 1980 before completing her Dr. Phil at Universität of Bamberg in 1986. Her work explores the social functions that prompt the making of art. Her first book, Donatio et Memoria, Stifter, Stiftungen und Motivationen an Beispielen aus der Lorenzkirche Nuremberg, published in 1990, considers why donors commissioned late medieval art, paying particular attention to both spiritual and social aspects. When I studied this marvelous book for the first time, a famous poem of Joseph Freiherr von Eichendorff came to my mind. It quoted in English afterwards. I quoted in German afterwards in English. Schläft ein Lied in allen Dingen, die da träumen, fort und fort, und die Welt hebt an zu singen, triffst du nur das Zauberwort. In English, sleeps a song in things abounding that keep dreaming to be heard. Earth's tunes will start resounding if you find the magic word. And Corine, in all her publications, found always a lot of magic words to make things talking. Her interests in archival sources, postmodern theory, women's agency, gift-giving cultures, and multisensory experience came together in her 2009 book, Katharina's Windows, Donation and Devotion, Art and Music, as heard and seen in the writings of a Brigitte nun, co-authored by Volker Schier. Together, they also initiated the ongoing Opening the Geese Book project, a model for exploring multisensory art of the past using modern multimedia technologies. In tonight's lecture, Corine Schleif will explore the reception of the German late Gothic sculptor Adam Kraft, whose works have endured in public places in Nuremberg for over 500 years. Drawing attention to the plurality of history and subjectivity of historiography, she will discuss the image of the artist in the eyes of his patrons and his own self-portraits, in addition to documenting how that image was later transformed by humanists and reformers, by Nazi propaganda and advertisers. She will examine how Kraft sculptures provide the basis for a discussion of how art has participated in religious rituals, economic developments, art historical debates, political decision-making, and military strategies, and will conclude her argument with questions about the place of art and its history in debates among current public intellectuals. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to Corine Schleif.
I hope I get to all of that in the talk, and I feel I need to apologize for my title. When we contend that something is as dead as stone, that a policy is hewn in stone, or that a notion, or even a colleague, I hope not a speaker, is as old as stone, in German Steinalt, we are not usually using this material to set up a positive analogy. And yet, these characteristics of endurance, permanence, intractability, age, unalterability, and even death are some of the associations that made and make this artistic material highly desirable and works in this medium highly prized. This evening, I'm going to tell you about the stone sculptor Adam Kraft and his works. Many of them have endured in Nuremberg since he made and installed them there, beginning in 1490 and ending with his in 1508. I must confess that my own book project has been underway for a bit longer than the period it took him to make these works in the first place. It began after my dissertation research in Nuremberg in the late 80s, early 90s, and it has stuck with me as I started and completed many other projects. This means that I've had the advantage of absorbing various approaches and ways of engaging art through critical theory. In fact, I have used Adam Kraft in his work to contour the history of art history as my introduction to the graduate level methodologies class that I regularly teach. This evening, I'm going to just touch on several moments in this 500-year history of Adam Kraft and his work. Adam Kraft's first documented patrons were Sebald Schreier and his uncle, Matthias Landauer. Both were among Nuremberg's most important social climbers and patrons of the arts. Both aspired to positions in the upper chamber of the city council. In 1490, they commissioned Kraft to translate the painted mural that adorned their family's burial plot on the exterior of the parish church of St. Sebald into the weather-resistant medium of stone relief. To do so, they had to request and be granted special permission from the elders of the city council. Through this work, they carved their niche into the Nuremberg cityscape. This might sound like a broadly metaphoric statement, but the mechanisms for social mobility and political enfranchisement were fairly concrete. In a letter from slightly later, 1516, the Nuremberg patrician Christoph Scheuel offers a concise description of the Nuremberg city government to his old friend, the Erfurt Vicar General of the German Augustinians, Johann Staupitz. The government of our city and the common weal rest in the hands of ancient families, people whose ancestors, even back in the earliest days, were also members of the government and ruled the city. Foreigners who have settled here and common people have nothing to say, nor ought they to. For all power is of God, and only those may exercise it whom the Creator has endowed with special wisdom. Therefore, we admit no one into our council whose parents and grandparents did not also sit in the council. The letter goes on to mention how exceptions are never made, well, hardly ever, and only in very, very rare cases. And so we have what is almost an admittedly counterfactual construction which denies social mobility and justifies political enfranchisement in a representative urban democracy as hereditary is aristocratic privilege. The so-called dance statutes of 1521 explain and even give names of individuals and families who moved into and even out of the Nuremberg social circles that customarily danced in the city hall and were eligible to participate in government. It went without saying that wealth was necessary, but this had to be garnered by any political genteel means that did not involve physical labor or actually touching the coinage. That means not through retail endeavors or, God forbid, peddling wares on the street. Further, one had to show the purity of bloodlines and acceptance into the rather limited and incestuous gene pool, which meant marrying with other already accepted patrician families. Additionally, those wishing to assume political leadership needed to show that they were public persons. They had accepted administrative posts and/or they had donated works that served the common good. Many memorial endowments combined liturgy, charity, and what we today call art. The Schreier-Landauer monument played an important role in marking the sacrificed body of Christ in the Eucharistic Tabernacle directly on the other side of the choir wall. You see it right here. Its narrative running atypically right to left, showing Christ carrying his cross, then omitting the crucifixion because Christ's sacrifice was present in the consecrated host kept inside the church on the other side of the wall, but picturing the empty cross of Christ, then the entombment, and finally, the resurrection. The relief delineated the processional path on Easter night when all of the flames had been extinguished and gradually all of the lights had to be rekindled, including the oil lamp that illuminated the epitaph. And it again lined the processional way during the daylight hours on the important civic festival of Corpus Christi. At any time, an indulgence was offered to devout persons who prayed at the kneeler set up in front of the monument. Thus, the Schreier-Landauer families showed that they had achieved financial success, that they could place themselves continually before the eyes of all in the center of town across from the city hall as civic-minded persons. In the sense of Jürgen Habermas, they had entered the public square. Also, that their ancestors were longtime residents of Nuremberg. Actually, almost no one could trace their lineage back past the 14th century. And that their family had long been marrying with families already accepted into the patrician caste. All of this was carved in stone, as if it had always already been there. We move now to Kraft's most famous work, the Eucharistic Tabernacle, commissioned by the patrician Hans IV Imhof in the other Nuremberg parish, St. Lawrence. The tabernacle replaced a smaller one on the periphery and moved the sacrament to the center of the glorious new hall choir. Imhof already held a seat in the upper chamber of the city council, but his family had not been there long. He likewise served as Führer of the sacrament. This meant he was one of the two patricians who led the Corpus Christi procession through the streets and carried the huge cloth baldachin, as if, rather audaciously I think, to offer safety and security for the very body of Christ. This protective role was carved permanently in stone with the costly architectural monument fashioned by the Kraft workshop between 1493 and 1496. Within the locked gilt container, a huge monstrance served to conceal and reveal the consecrated host. The iconography of the reliefs explained the meaning and essence of this small white wheaten wafer. The ornamentation and the size of the structure proclaimed its significance. As with many monuments of this time, it was of utmost importance that the patrons provided for its maintenance for all eternity. After all, the works were erected to ensure a space for the donors in heaven and to secure the political and social place of the donors in Nuremberg. An endowment was therefore established from which the costs for cleaning and repairs were paid, as well as for wax candles that were held by 8 no longer extant gilt angels donated by the 8 Imhof sons for the balustrade. The coats of arms of the Imhof children, emblazoned on the lower edge of the cabinet, are arranged in order of their birth, allied with their spouses, and reflect their succession in responsibility for administering the upkeep and continuation of the candle lighting. I was very happy to find this document chronicling the first cleaning and repairs, which enlisted the services of Adam Kraft, 2 members of his workshop, and his wife. Amounts for the wax are mentioned on another page. And by the way, funds for cleaning and restoration are today more scarce, as you can see from some of the photographs. We have a spider web here and a little dust. Of course, the artist seized the opportunity to insert themselves into these substantial permanent monuments. This had been the prerogative of scribes and artisans since the early Middle Ages. Like their patrons, they wished to market themselves as pious and as successful. The strategies differ from work to work. In the Schreier-Landauer epitaph, Kraft carves himself, together with Landauer, conversing, like the moderators on the evening news. But unlike the paired television anchors, their identities are projected onto the holy figures of Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who hold the crown of thorns, the nails, and the pliers after having just removed Christ from the cross. In another epitaph, that for the Pergensdorfer family, originally in the cloister of the Augustinian monastery, Adam Kraft appears in the crowd of the faithful, protected under the Virgin's cloak, almost like Alfred Hitchcock, who hides himself in the crowd in his movies. It is often asserted that his best-known self-portrait in St. Lawrence, that in his best-known self-portrait, this one, Kraft upstages his patrons, appearing almost life-size, truly monumental in comparison to the rather inconspicuous Imhof family arms. I would argue that these kneeling figures of the workshop served both the artists and the patrons quite well. For the workshop, they advertised the artists, their trade, their virtuosity. For the patrician patrons, however, these sculpted laborers in work attire, no matter how thoughtful, sleek, agile, and even fashionable they may appear to us, helped to keep them in their place. They worked with their hands and tools. They were not allowed to wear the patrician's Schaube with its opulent fur lapels. If I were to indulge in a modern comparison, you have to forgive me for this one, it might be those early, unnerving, hyper-realistic life-size figures fashioned by Dwayne Hansen in the 1960s and 70s, which may have been intended by the artist to facilitate a close-up view of lower-class, unpretentious, mundane individual realities. But especially during the decades they were fashioned, they elicited variant readings for many viewers, and many of them are in German museums. They represented typical Americans. For American museum visitors, they typified working-class shoppers or lower-middle-class tourists. Of course, the big difference here is that these folks were not responsible for making their own self-portraits. If indeed Adam Kraft was up to anything subversive, it was probably not in his self-portraits, but in his subtle humor. I can give you several examples. In his relief for the city scales, he shows a wealthy merchant, his face full of indignation, forced to thrust his own hand deeply into his purse to personally pay the toll he owes upon having his wares weighed. In the relief carved for the tympanum of the Mauthalle, where goods were stored prior to the payment of tariffs, Kraft included a little mongrel dog beneath the colorful arms of the Empire and Nuremberg. Was this mutt a reference to the fact that the pedigree of the Nuremberg patricians was not as pure as they contended? Perhaps most subversive, was the hidden figure of the well-dressed little patrician being attacked by a dragon, concealed beneath the encircling walkway of the Eucharistic Tabernacle. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen has recently written that you can tell a lot about a culture from the monsters it creates. Interestingly, Adam Kraft created one that devoured patricians tucked away from view within a work commissioned by just such a powerful patrician. And lastly, perhaps an additional touch of humor can be recognized in the finial that crowns the sacrament house. Is it inhibited by the vaulting of the soaring structure, or does it challenge and threaten to poke a hole in it as it grows up and unfurls itself through the heavens, to the heavens? We've already crossed the fluid border between the producers of these works and their audiences. At an undetermined date, Kraft sculpted 7 reliefs that were mounted on sockles above eye level to punctuate the route leading out of the city to the new cemetery at St. Johannes. After recurrent outbreaks of the plague, this safer location had been proposed for reasons of public health. The path offered a mini pilgrimage for those Nuremberg citizens who couldn't or wouldn't journey to Jerusalem. Although often referenced by their 19th-century name, the Stations of the Cross, the sculptures should more accurately be called the 7 Falls of Christ, because they show Christ falling down as he is tormented and made to carry his cross on the way to Golgotha. The series culminated with a crucifixion scene of which these 3 sculpted figures survive. Those who passed along this way, accompanying dead family members in funeral processions or subsequently visiting their graves, could relate to the biblical persons in the reliefs in various ways. Following the models defined by Robert Jauss, we can identify the ultimate admirative model as Christ, who suffers bodily pain patiently without despair. Likewise, let's see, did I forget to advance something here? Here we go. Likewise, the Virgin, Saint Veronica, and the other holy women provide the gendered role models of caretakers. They suffer emotionally with the empathic pain of the onlooker in anguish of loss. Like them, many wives who walked this liminal route returned with a changed social role, that of the widow. The active mourners participate ritually with the relief carvings. Christ falls under the weight of the cross. The mourners walk on. He falls again. The living get up and walk on. He falls. They continue. And this is repeated 7 times. The series offers repetition, like the stories retold or reread to children at bedtime, even scary ones. The outcomes are predictable and therefore comforting. Those with whom the mourners were not to identify were those who tortured Christ and made him fall. They are shown as soldiers, low-class thugs, perhaps non-Europeans, even West Africans, but also as Jews. In fact, the inscription accompanying this relief tells us, and he was beaten very hard by the Jews. Several older figures follow behind, well-dressed with exotic costumes, including orientalized head coverings and long, full beards, bearing the smug expressions of those who order, consult, and oversee without exerting themselves physically or laying on a hand. They represent the high-level Jewish authorities who tried and condemned Christ. The years 1498 and 1499 saw a pogrom against the Nuremberg Jews. 12 families were driven out after being scapegoated for a financial crisis wrought when the patrician caste began to tighten money and force the non-patrician craftsmen and shopkeepers to borrow sums from Jewish bankers. When their situation worsened, the borrowers could not repay their loans, and the lenders foreclosed. Interestingly, stone surfaces are acoustically reflective, and so the voices of the disgruntled could be projected onto them and bounced back in the form of images of Jews who killed Christ, which in turn could echo the justification for the pogrom. Needless to say, the newly bereaved who followed this path may have also been emotionally vulnerable. With the introduction of the Lutheran Reformation in Nuremberg in 1525, the Eucharistic Tabernacle became an object of intense debate. Peter Imhoff took over family responsibilities for providing the candles to burn on special days in veneration of the host. As far as I can tell from his records, these practices persisted until 1527. Likewise, during these years, Nuremberg clergymen took up different sides against reserving the host because it was idolatrous, or in favor of it, so as not to cause offense among the devout, also against Eucharistic tabernacles as the cause of error, and also in favor of them, defending them against iconoclastic destruction. Then, in 1532, the humanist Helius Eobanus Hesses, who had been called to teach in the new school founded by Philip Melanchthon, engaged the Eucharistic Tabernacle in a completely different manner. He wrote a poem. The reason for his poem was he wanted a raise. And so he composed an encomium to the city of Nuremberg in 1,385 Latin verses. He praised the imperial forests that surrounded the city, the Pegnitz River that runs through the city, and only two, of the city's artistic monuments, the reliquary shrine of St. Sebald and the Eucharistic Tabernacle in the Church of St. Lawrence. In his description of the tabernacle, Eobanus negates any and all religious function of this structure. The iconography is neither described nor even identified, although nearly all of it is biblical and completely in keeping with Reformation theology. Eobanus praises the Eucharistic Tabernacle as the work of a talented, although unnamed artist, and mentions the atlas-like figures that, quote, are struggling to rise under the weight of the structure. But more than the artistic virtuosity and skill manifested in what he called bending and curving the diffident medium of stone, which he misidentifies as gleaming white marble, Eobanus lauds the monument on formal grounds. Most of his words describe the architectural ornamentation, that sandstone tracery that he describes with mixed metaphors and analogies, comparing it to plant motifs, wicker basketry, and woven cloth. In the end, he exclaims that the muse has forbidden him to say any more. In other words, the work defies verbal conceptualization, but speaks for itself as a form. Thus, this monument was saved from any iconoclastic tendencies precipitated by its significance and meaning. It was also rescued from all loss of importance due to its obsolescence. It had been transformed into something that did not exist before, a human-made object, beautiful of and for itself, art. In the Roman Catholic Church of the Middle Ages, everything played a role in God's plan for salvation. Everything was brimming with intrinsic meaning and soteriological significance, which needed only to be discovered and explicated. As Lutheran intellectual reformer, Melanchthon had employed the Greek term adiaphora, meaning things that are in the middle or neutral, that do not matter for salvation, and developed the notion as an important Lutheran doctrine. The space of adiaphora became a safe place in which art could be born and appreciated. These possibilities of apprehending beauty through purely formal perception, without utility, and even defying verbal conceptualization, foreshadow the late Environment notions of aesthetic pleasure voiced by Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten and Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. But it must be remembered that the self-conscious display of social status that had made its way into an important space within the hierarchy of places had been allowed only in the context of pious sacred furnishings that served the communal interests of the faithful. The markers, initially both legitimated and masked through the primacy of religious functions, now during the Reformation, once again, both legitimated and masked by overriding appeal as universally pleasing forms. Once again, the later Protestant generations of the Imhoff family could feel a bond with their Catholic foremothers and forefathers. In 1547, Johann Neudorfer, a Nuremberg master of writing and bookkeeping as well as a vocational school teacher, wrote his collected biographies of Nuremberg artists and craftsmen. To Adam Kraft, whom he calls a builder and a stonemason, he devoted the longest of his 79 entries. Like the Florentine Giorgio Vasari, who authored his far more encyclopedic work in the next decade, Neudorfer reviewed the main works within an artist, revealed their locations, praised artists for certain features of their art, and often incorporated amusing or banal anecdotes, often at the expense of their wives, actually. Neudorfer repeats the assertion of Eobanus that Kraft could soften stone. Interestingly, in the context of Eoban's poem, the remark seemed metaphorical. With Neudorfer, it takes on concrete credibility in that he likewise uses the verb to pour and explains the contemporary process of stone casting and then firing in order to harden figures that were initially malleable or formed in a mold. However, we know of no works that Kraft executed using this medium and technique. Neudorfer's other descriptions of the methods for Kraft's fashioning of crocketed finials and bent filaments on the Eucharistic Tabernacle are, however, very accurate and correct. Small pieces of carved stone were drilled and fit over metal armatures. Neudorfer praises Kraft as ambidextrous and an able teacher of even those workers who came to him totally inexperienced. And as anecdote, Neudorfer tells of one of Kraft's wives, a widow named Magdalena, who let Adam call her Eve in order to please him. Thus we can watch how art history begins as the history of artists. This engine, yesterday even playing an important role in search engines, continues to be fueled using the supposed biographies of great men to create and organize knowledge about art. The idea that an artist could soften, bend, or mold stone did not originate in the literature on Adam Kraft. A topos that originated in classical antiquity, the notion plays gleefully against Kraft's presentation of himself holding mallet and chisel. It persisted in much of the subsequent 17th and 18th century literature on Kraft, including that in Joachim von Sandrart's multi-volume, widely distributed and highly influential collection of artists' biographies. The travel literature on Nuremberg, and the local descriptive inventories, all of which included Kraft's work, made the Eucharistic Tabernacle into a great curiosity. Some of the publications were illustrated and would have carried the conversations about the work into the private libraries and parlors of the day. Some writers tout the faculty of softening and hardening stone as secret knowledge or magic, almost like alchemy. Other writers contended, quite contrarily, that the Eucharistic Tabernacle was miraculously monolithic, carved from one gigantic piece of solid sandstone. It's never explained how they got it in the door. But with the advance of the 18th century, Christoph Gottlieb von Moor began to contend that Kraft was more craftsman than artistic genius. He, like other authors, continued to react to the ever-present the ever-present imposing self-portraits. Kraft and the two members of his workshop held their monument on their shoulders. They never left. They never stopped engaging with individual viewers personally, looking each in the eye with a penetrating stare. And yet, not living persons or even actors or the historical impersonators we meet today at Renaissance fairs, these persons were made of stone and could be scrutinized at close range. And so, Christoph Friedrich Nicolai, who wished to see Kraft as the epitome of the diligent, careful, painstaking, tireless craftsman, could use scientific observation to prove his assessments. Having familiarized himself with the studies of the Zurich theologian Johann Caspar Lavater, who had recently published his Physiognomischen Fragmente, containing diagrams that mapped intelligence and other character traits onto the physical characteristics of the head and face, Nicolai wrote of Adam Kraft, I have observed the face of this master with great attention and pleasure. It is all nature and expression. The man has a significant form of forehead, deep-set eyes of the kind that Mr. Lavater in his Physiognomy calls not really artist's eyes, and a wide mouth with straight, evenly cut lips, of the same kind that I have often run into among the mechanical artists in Nuremberg and Augsburg. We would say the craftsmen and the artisans, not the artists. Lavater himself had contended that the most beautiful painters, they were for him Rubens, Van Dyck, and Raphael, had made the most beautiful paintings. And so we witnessed how in the 1780s, Adam Kraft's self-portrait participates in the discussions that grounded the determinacy of social class on external congenital physical characteristics. And I need not stress for this audience how these discourses fed into those farther-reaching naturalizations of the integrated categories of ethnicity, race, gender, and animality that we today attach to Lavater's publications. We turn now to the romantic cultural politics of the 18th and 19th centuries. Indeed, Nuremberg had been fashioned as the center of German culture already at the end of the 18th century, when the famous romanticist Wilhelm Wackenroder, on his way through Franconia, praised Adam Kraft's House for the Sacrament as extremely artful. In his nostalgic longing for sacred medieval art, he viewed as typically German, he historicizes Nuremberg as a place shrouded in the mists of the past, but alive and teeming with the art of the fatherland. Napoleon's imperialism and hegemony were also met with cultural resistance. Friedrich Schlegel asserted, until the recent days of destruction and chaos, each nation of old had a definite physiognomy of customs and lifestyles, feelings and forms, as well as its own music, architecture, and art. The pursuit of national identity led to attempts to find historical roots and to collect and preserve the witness of past regional and national heritage, be they historical documents, orally received fairy tales and folklore, songs, poems, and art. Nuremberg's efforts along these lines included founding the Germanisches Nationalmuseum, which was aspiring to be the largest museum of German culture, displaying not only art, but also folk art, instruments, and other historical artifacts. Works by Adam Kraft were also included there. To be sure, this was also a time when works still in situ within the city became the subject of debates. Should they be housed for safekeeping? Should they be replaced with copies? Questions regarding conservation were posed. How aggressive should it be? How much should be discarded? How much should be retained? struggles over jurisdiction and ownership, responsibility and rights of preservation raged. When, in 1901, a stray cat dared to appropriate the Eucharistic Tabernacle as her climbing tree, a well-meaning wagon master with a very long whip came to discourage her from becoming too comfortable up there. The cat landed safely on a mat and scampered happily away. But the figure of St. John, not designed for such adventures, suffered serious collateral damage. We know of the incident only because of the ensuing argument over who was responsible for the repair of the work. Was it the church or the city? Meanwhile, some proponents of the Gothic revival, like the architect Alexander von Heideloff, thought they could improve upon the medieval heritage and make it appear more medieval, or at least to represent it as more medieval. The Nuremberg artists of the late Middle Ages were brought back as celebrated geniuses and heroes, earning a place on the walls of the City Hall. And in these hallowed halls of the American Academy, I find this painting rather amusing. 12 individuals, each from a different specialty, posing nonchalantly for a group portrait, as if in casual conversation with each other. Adam Kraft no longer holds the Eucharistic Tabernacle on his shoulders. He has risen to the occasion and almost disrespectfully leans on the tabernacle, which has become his identifying attribute. It now holds him up. We turn now to a tiny sampling of the multifarious ways in which Adam Kraft's work was appropriated within the early years of the establishment of the formal academic discipline of art history as a Wissenschaft. It is well known that art history as a study, from the moment of its inception, was fraught with national categories. Going all the way back to the Czari, the Gothic was stigmatized as both German and barbaric. As art history was emerging as the history of period styles, a veritable tug-of-war developed between the terms Gothic and Renaissance. I give you two examples to illustrate how this battle was waged over Adam Kraft's Eucharistic Tabernacle. In 1871, Wilhelm Lübke described what he recognized as aspects related to the Renaissance. And I quote, "It holds in its upper portions small, overcrowded scenes from the Passion, an appropriately composed representation of the Last Supper and other figural decoration, which, however, is covered up too much by the crinkly forms of architecture in order to be appreciated or valued. On the lower portions, however, small figures of saints are arranged, including a sweet Madonna. Most important are the life-size kneeling figures. These forms are masterful character images, full of portrait-like verisimilitude, executed very excellently." Heinrich Wölfflin, however, wrote much differently about the same object in his description from 1905. The Eucharistic Tabernacle that Adam Kraft erected in the Church of St. Lawrence in Nuremberg can be called the quintessence of late Gothic form. Is there another construct that holds fantasy and constant movement as this one does? Nowhere a clear transition. Everything is in flux. Every part intersects with the next. The eye must search, overlapping members hide important beginnings, and the figures are nestled in deep shadowy caverns. It is the most unclassical that German soil has ever brought forth. For Italian sensitivities, it is an abomination. But for us, a source of inexhaustible excitement. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, many art historians found ways of connecting Kraft's work with what they were constructing as German, not only style, but also content. Writing in 1921, Georg de Hio generally praised the artists of late medieval Nuremberg, but specifically he lauded Kraft as a German artist who found his way out of the Gothic into what he calls freedom without the aid of the Renaissance. In the figure of Christ, in the Seven Falls, he saw an image of masculine dignity maintained in suffering and considered it a valuable historical document of the German ethos. Imbuing the figure with teleological power, he contours it into an overarching history with the observation: one recognizes that from this masculine dignity, a Martin Luther could emerge. Thus, we witness how, long after the Reformation, the rear-view mirror images of Kraft's sculptures were perceived by some, like Wackenroder, as, and I know this isn't a word, but ur-Germanly Catholic, and by others, like de Hio, as ur-Germanly Lutheran. In 1924, Friedrich Hack commented on de Hio's assessments and added that he saw in the figure of the suffering Christ a symbol of German pathos, and that the sculpted Christ personified the suffering of Germany as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, referring, of course, to the reparations imposed on Germany after World War I. Hack continues his critique by undertaking a kind of, and forgive me for saying it, ethnic cleansing of Nuremberg artists working around 1500. Veit Stoss, who we've been seeing here with his work, The Angelic Breeding, Veit Stoss, he chided for erring from his ways after becoming involved with Polish art and culture. In truth, he probably was Polish, and he did sculpt a big art altarpiece at Krakow. Peter Fischer fell prey to the sins of, quote, worshiping Latin culture. Apparently that happened when he took a trip to Italy. But Adam Kraft, in their midst, remains simply German, according to Hack. Cleverly, the National Socialists took up many of the associations within this tight mesh of the discursive net into which Kraft's sculptures had been entangled: changelessness, endurance, strength, medievalness, masculinity, and Germanness. However, new polarities were established, which sparked anxieties and aggression. It was now no longer into a struggle against classical antiquity, the Italian Renaissance, French cultural imperialism, or even Polish exuberance, but rather into a battle against the decadence and degeneracy of contemporary German art that Adam Kraft's sculptures had been conscripted. The guidebooks published for Nuremberg, now known officially as the City of the Imperial Party Congress, often paralleled the golden age of Nuremberg from the 14th to the 16th centuries with its contemporary imperial grandeur. As if drawing on all of the constructions we have just reviewed, many of which were in one form or another harbored in collective memory, the Nazis contended that Nuremberg was legitimated historically through its late medieval art treasures, and even gave Nuremberg a new nickname, the Imperial Treasure House. The Allies, as if believing the propaganda, responded with the iconoclastic bombings in the winter and spring of 1945. That's St. Lawrence. And this is the Eucharistic Tabernacle, or what's part of it protected and a little bit of it destroyed. On April 18th, a few days before the fall of Hitler's Third Reich, the American Armed Forces newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, called Nuremberg the Shrine of German Art. For the Allies, the 450-year-old works of Adam Kraft conveyed Nazi ideology and glorified the German Empire as a seamless, everlasting whole that had been carved in stone and was always already present. In closing, I would like to plead that we allow the dead stones of the past to speak to us. If we keep them among us as actants that have often played the part of actors in history, to borrow words now used by Bruno Latour and other proponents of actor network theory, or related eco-critical approaches, we can use them to engage with the past. As a parting thought, I would like to quote the Israeli-born historian Miri Rubin, who in her study of the various aspects of the cult of Corpus Christi, including anti-Semitic aspects, challenges us today to learn how to negotiate liberating meanings. Thank you.
So much, Corine, for this overwhelming, really overwhelming material you showed to us. I'm sure there are questions. It was really inspiring.
Thank you. You gave us a couple of examples of Kraft sneaking little pieces into his work, like the dragon attacking the patrician. I wonder if there are any more instances of that, or if he was ever caught and got in trouble, and if that's the case, if that affected his works after that, if his commissioners sort of had to warn him, or this sort of thing, if there were any consequences, I guess is my question.
These are the only ones I found, but I have the feeling that these were some of the privileges that artists had, and I think it has a very long medieval tradition. I just got finished editing a book on books changing hands in the Middle Ages, and we looked through all the different ways that scribes and medieval illuminators work themselves into their works, and they do it in very idiosyncratic ways. They seem to sort of take pleasure in finding really creative ways to do it, and I have never ever read or seen anybody crossing any of these things out or read any marginal note that says, how dare he. So I think it was a kind of unarticulated privilege of artists and scribes and artisans to do this.
Can you speak to his use of color and whether that affected the interpretations in art history or by political agents?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of these big debates that the people restoring the works have been involved in the last years. We have in the sources, there's one source for the Schreier-Landauer epitaph that they, when it was all finished, they put some kind of a Schlemme, some kind of a wash over it. And we don't know exactly what that was. It might have been something to make it look a more uniform gray color, make it look more like stone. It already was stone, but we know this is often done with wooden sculpture as well. And then on the Eucharistic Tabernacle, there's some evidence that there was also some kind of a wash over it. Actually, the wife of Adam Kraft, what she gets paid for when 2 years after the work is done and the whole workshop comes and they get paid for repairs and cleaning, she's paid for, the source says, grinding stone meal. It took me a while to read those words, but Steinmehl. And we don't know what that was used for. It was either suspended in some kind of liquid and painted over the surface, or maybe it was used as kind of mortar between, to fill into the cracks.
Thank you, Corine. This was totally fascinating. And I have two questions. One of them, I'm over here, yeah. One of my questions might be totally bonkers because I know nothing about this time period, so you can just ignore it. So I was thinking about craftsmanship and the relationship in particular between artisanship and technical knowledge, or what would be called maybe a century later, techne and episteme. And from what I understand of craftsmanship around this time, this was a moment before technical and theoretical knowledge would have been cleanly divided, that in fact the ability to know how to make something also imparted some kind of knowledge about how that thing works, what kind of internal rules guide its form, but also potentially function. This became important later on with the scientific revolution because artisans were able to tell people something about naturalia that they had crafted. So my question, this is very roundabout, is whether there's a way of thinking about this kind of craftsmanship the kind of work that Kraft was doing as also imparting some kind of knowledge about how things work, and in particular the structure of society in Nuremberg at the time, the relationship between patricians and the general population, because it seems like he had a very trenchant critique of that social structure. And the second thing I have to say, just because you mentioned Latour, it's like catnip for me, is I'm curious, you mentioned both eco-criticism and A&T, and there's a huge argument, as I'm sure you know, between the two right now. I've been writing about stones and vitality as well, and people accuse me of being an eco-feminist, and I'm wondering where you fall sort of in that conversation.
Oh, well, I don't know where to start with all those questions, but to go to the first question, all we have from Kraft are his works themselves. We have nothing that he wrote, except when there's a document and he says, like a receipt that I got the money, we're okay. We sind quittledigen los. So that doesn't tell us that he had any kind of special, that he was very self-aware or self-conscious of his own doing, or even when he put the little patrician down in the bottom. So all we have are those works themselves. There are other contemporary artists, though, Albrecht Dürer, who's more self-aware, and he's very aware of how he's treated and his role in society, and he's very uneasy, actually. He's not sure how he wants people to treat him. He's not sure where he should be in society and whether he's being treated well enough, especially in Nuremberg. He says he's treated better in Italy, and so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it goes in the direction of the first question. And the second question, where I stand on eco-criticism and A&T, I find them both useful. As you could tell, I'm a real eclectic. I pick and choose and pull here and there when it seems to make sense. I look at the material, the art, the writings on it first, and then I try to see what I find useful. But I don't know if that answers your question either, but maybe we'll have more chances to talk about it. I hope so. Eliza.
Thank you, Corine, for your talk. I have to say that before your talk, I suppose I had a layman's interest in Adam Kraft, right? Because I work on things that are much earlier than this. I've always appreciated it, and I've gone to see everything he made in Nuremberg. What I was struck by in your beautiful slides is the antiquity of the faces and the self-conscious excellence of the work. And I am wondering about not only the models he might have been looking at, specifically antique models, antique sculptural models, but also if in fact he was looking at antique sculptural models, how might have that been received in the later literature on Kraft in the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century?
It's absolutely never mentioned that he followed, well, I guess it's mentioned in the people who saw that he was very Renaissance. I mean, there's a slight mention of it. I think that was in one of the quotes I read. But otherwise, he's kind of seen as completely going in the other direction. Although, when you look at the two thieves on the cross flanking Christ, it's definitely there.
I think it's there.
Brenda.
Yeah, thank you, Corine. This was amazing because you showed really the dialogue between architecture and art and how ornament draws a line between the two. I never saw it like that, so this is really striking. And then the other thing I thought was amazing when you spoke about Wackenroder and his discovery of the Middle Ages as we know it, beginning of 19th century. And I hope we'll get to talk about Ludwig Tieck's Franz Sternbald's Wanderungen, which is the quintessential book of this time and influenced me a lot when I was an art student. My question is a very practical one. I was looking at the surface. I never came so close to these sculptures, and I think I should go back and do that. There is color. And I was wondering how much color there was. I mean, the faces. I mean, they look like makeup. I mean, they have rouge à lèvres and they have powdered cheeks, and it's amazing. And the curls are also shaped by color, besides being sculpted. And I was wondering how the dresses and everything else, was it really like in French cathedrals, like pop colored, intense, or not?
I don't think so. But my question is not just where was the color, but how old is that color?
Ah, okay. So maybe it was attached later, you think?
It's possible. It's been a real controversy. You know, the surfaces of some of the lower sculptures there on the Eucharistic Tabernacle are very abraded.
Ah, okay.
And so something happened after the Second World War, and the restorers are not so happy with each other. I was in a meeting once when they kind of got into it with who did this and why. And so we need somebody to look at that, the rouge and the lipstick, to see how old it is and whether it follows something that's underneath that it's trying to just bring out or reproduce or not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Corine. That was wonderful. I have one question, which is, can you tell me a little bit about the workshop? You know, who were the people who were in the workshop, and where did they come from, and how long did it take for him to train them? And well, this is another little tiny one, but whether or not there were people who were famous students of his.
Well, the quick answer to the first part of the question is no, I can't. We have a source when they do the cleaning. There are two names that I mentioned, first names, Ulrich and Christoph. So they might be the two people who are represented there. We really don't know how big the workshop was. There's a project going on having to do with work elsewhere in Germany, having to do with artist workshops. But on Adam Kraft, we're kind of at the limits of what the sources will tell us. And with to the second question, with the advent of the Reformation, that's kind of the end of these artist workshops. So there's, not a lot. He was at a particular moment in history where he's not going to have lots of followers. So,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much again for your wonderful talk. I was wondering, every time I read the contract that is conveyed, that in that contract it is so...
This is the contract for the Eucharistic Tabernacle.
And the parts that are, it's such a showy art piece actually, because it's so calculated in its visibility. Which parts are facing the beholder that have to be more delicate, and others that are less delicate, and related to the place where Adam Kraft portrayed himself. How would you juxtapose this to your observations?
I think what it says is something like he was supposed to pay special attention to the parts of the work that were really visible from the ground, and what was done up on top wasn't so important. I mean, as if they're being just really pragmatic about, if it's farther away, we can't see it anyway, don't bother so much. I've never heard that Adam Kraft really did that, though. I have, on one occasion, there was a scaffolding, and I was able to climb all the way up there. Of course, the very top, if you saw those last photographs of the destruction of the Second World War, the very top of it that wasn't protected by that structure that they built around it, it was smashed to smithereens by the bombs that fell. So that looks much crisper today, and it's because it's all post-45. Julian had a question.
Thank you, Corine. This was extremely stimulating, and I really admired your ability to make us look through several centuries of criticism and reception of that work. I'm not entirely sure where I want to go with my question, but I'll do my best. 15 years ago, I did an exhibition in New York on Riemenschneider.
Yes, I remember it.
And the reason I'm saying that is we were desperately trying to find funding from German companies, and nobody would touch Riemenschneider with a stick. Deutsche Bank, Hugo Boss, all the big German firms who have business in America will not touch anything that was no German art created before 1945. The rationale being that Riemenschneider was appropriated by the Nazis. And the problem is that everything from Bach to Beethoven to Goethe to Dürer to all the German artists were appropriated one way or another. And one thing that I've read a lot of historiography also on French art from the beginning of the 20th century, or literature from the early 20th century on French medieval art. And there is also a very strong nationalistic tone, and medieval art is anti-Semitic in most of Europe. And I think that my question is, can you look at Adam Kraft and the imagery and making abstraction or trying without the prism of National Socialism? I find it extremely puzzling, and I wonder if this type of inquiry is also happening in French art history for French art. Because if you read literature on Chartres Cathedral, I think there's also a celebration of the French spirit, etc.
What I observe, and I don't know if I should say this or not, but what I observe is, we have these waves of things. It's acceptable to use certain topics as themes for exhibitions from certain years, then we distance ourselves. And certainly there was this long period of distancing from the German art that had been appropriated by the Nazis until very recently. I mean, some people have pointed out that changed with reunification, that since the two parts of Germany were together, then that could be, Germanness could once again be celebrated. I mean, this year and last year, how many Kranach exhibitions do we have? Every museum has a Kranach exhibition. I don't know if you're asking if I think that's good or bad. I think the last part of the question was, I think that we should not avoid looking at this work, but we need to look at the writings about it, everything that has sort of metaphorically collected on the surfaces. The worst thing to do would be to lock it away in some closet somewhere and pretend it didn't exist. I mean, I was somewhat almost amused by the exhibition at the Städel last year before, about paintings that used to be, they incorporated some sculpture as well, and I should say that some of my friends did that exhibition, and it was a beautiful exhibition. But they wanted to change the name of the Danube School, the Donauschule, because the Danube School had been appropriated by the Nazis, and so they wanted to call it expressionistic, but I mean the word expressionism is also heavily laden. So I wondered, what the sense was. I mean, they didn't want to rename the river. I mean, we'd have to rename Wannsee.
But if I think the French don't have any problem having sculpture française on one half of the Louvre and sculpture étrangère on the other half, and I think this would not happen in a German museum. I don't think you would have German sculpture completely separate from other European sculpture. Anyway, it's not a question, it's more common, but thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe we should turn it around and ask what you want to do in your museum.
I'm going to show African sculpture.
Good.
Thank you very much, Corinne.